The path off the Midlothian Turnpike is unpaved and narrow, just wide enough for a single walker, and within the first 100 yards, the sound of passing traffic on the road behind fades to something barely audible, a low wash of noise that the woodland absorbs before it can follow a visitor any further in. The trees close around the path quickly. Oak and hickory press in from both sides. The canopy overhead dense enough in the warmer months to hold the light at a remove, and the ground beneath shifts from hardpack to something softer, the leaf litter deep and damp. The earth low-lying enough in this part of Cook County's Rubio Woods Forest Preserve that moisture collects and sits. The quarter-mile walk-in feels longer than it is. The forest has a quality of compression, sound shortening, distances folding slightly, that is simply a feature of second-growth woodland in a low-lying terrain, the kind of quiet that develops when a landscape has been left to itself for long enough. At the end of that path, in a clearing that the trees have been working to reclaim for the better part of 60 years, there is a cemetery. It is small. Its boundaries are not immediately clear from any single vantage point. The grave markers that remain standing are limestone, for the most part, pale against the darker ground cover, their carved surfaces worn to varying degrees, depending on how long each one has been standing in the weather and how much the vegetation around its base has shifted and pulled at the stone. Some markers lean, some have fallen. The clearing itself retains only the suggestion of its original shape, the tree line having advanced from what was once a visible and maintained boundary into something closer to an enclosure. Standing at the entrance to the cemetery on any given morning, with the mist low above the leaf litter and the canopy holding the light, it is possible to understand that this place was once something quite different from what it is now, and to trace in the surviving stones and the shape of the ground what it used to be. Bachelor's Grove Cemetery was established by the most reliable documentary evidence available no later than 1844. The location is Bremen Township, Cook County, Illinois, in what was then a region of dispersed agricultural settlement west of the main population centers of the Chicago area. The first documented burial at the site was recorded within that same decade, among the farming families of European descent who had moved into the territory and begun the work of clearing, planting, and building that characterized pioneer settlement in the Midwestern interior during the 1830s and 1840s. These families came from Germany and from other parts of Northern and Central Europe, and they brought with them the funerary customs of the rural communities they had left, the limestone markers, the carved names, the brief epitaphs, the family plots organized so that the dead remained grouped as the living had been in households and generations rather than in isolated individual graves. What they established at Bachelor's Grove was not a grand or formal burial ground. It was a modest community cemetery of the kind that appeared throughout the rural Midwest during this period, located near enough to the farms it served to be practical and maintained by the same families whose names were accumulating on its markers. Those markers, the oldest of them, are still partially legible. A limestone slab from the 1840s carries its carved letters imperfectly. The stone is soft enough that a century and a half of frost and thaw and rain has rounded the edges of the cuts, filling the deepest lines with mineral deposit and eroding the shallowest ones back toward the flat surface, but the names and dates have not entirely surrendered. Tilted slightly forward where the earth has shifted beneath it, the way old cemetery markers in low-lying terrain tend to do when the ground moves through repeated cycles of freeze and saturation. A stone from this period still holds its shape well enough to read. The carving on markers of this era followed conventions that are recognizable across dozens of rural Illinois cemeteries from the same decades. A name, a birth year, a death year, sometimes the age of the deceased calculated in years and months and days, in the manner of the period, and occasionally a brief phrase, a scriptural citation, a statement of faith, a note of familial relationship. These are the standard marks of rural Midwestern funerary custom in the mid-19th century, and the surviving markers at Bachelor's Grove are consistent with that pattern, placing the cemetery firmly within its historical time and place. The total number of individuals buried at Bachelor's Grove is a figure that the historical record does not pin down with precision. Estimates drawn from available documentation, burial records, marker surveys, township records place the number somewhere between 75 and 200, the wide range reflecting the fact that not every interment was formally recorded, that markers have been lost over the years through breakage and removal and the slow work of the soil, and that the earliest burials from the 1840s may not all have been accompanied by permanent stone markers at all. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the cemetery served a specific and identifiable community of farming families over a period of roughly 100 years, from the 1840s through the mid-20th century. That the names on its oldest surviving markers are the names of the people who built and maintained and were buried by that community. Among those names, the Fulton family and the Ritter family appear on some of the oldest surviving markers at the site, and both surnames are historically associated with the founding settlement around the cemetery and its surrounding area. The Fulton family plot, as it exists today, consists of multiple markers from different decades of the 19th century, clustered together in one corner of the grounds, some upright, some leaning at angles that have developed over the years as the ground beneath them has shifted, all of them carrying the same surname in varying degrees of legibility. And the clustering of family plots in a specific area of the cemetery is consistent with rural burial practice of the period in which families maintained and preserved their own sections of shared community ground, adding markers decade by decade as the generations turned. Looking at the Fulton plot now, with its markers from the 1840s and the 1850s and later decades standing together in their corner of the clearing, it is possible to read the outline of a family's presence in a place over time, arrivals, losses, the accumulation of years. Thord. The name of the cemetery itself is a matter of documented historical debate, which is itself a small and interesting feature of the historical record. Two competing explanations appear in sources that have examined the question. The first traces the name to a cluster of unmarried men, bachelors in the common parlance of the period, who settled in the wooded area along the Midlothian Turnpike corridor during the 1820s and 1830s, before the land had been formally surveyed or the farming community had fully organized itself around the area. Under this explanation, the name attached to the settlement and subsequently to the cemetery that the settlement established, the informal label hardening into place through repeated use until it became the accepted designation on maps and in local speech. The second explanation traces the name not to the marital status of early settlers, but to a specific family, spelled in various sources as Batchelder or Bachelor, whose presence in the area predated the formal land surveys of the period, and who may have given their name to the grove, and through it to the cemetery. Neither explanation has been definitively settled in favor of one or the other, and both appear in the historical literature with sufficient documentary support that researchers have been cautious about dismissing either account. This kind of ambiguity, a place whose name carries two competing origin stories, both plausible, neither provable beyond the available evidence, is not unusual in rural Midwestern settlement history. The early documentation is thin. Maps from before the formal surveys are often incomplete or inconsistent. Oral tradition and written record intersect at points where the written record is itself uncertain, and the result is that some facts about a place's origins remain genuinely open even when the place itself is well documented and its later history is clear. What is not in dispute at Bachelor's Grove is the physical existence of the cemetery, the names on its markers, and the community that created and used it. The origin of the name is a detail that the historical record holds lightly, without insisting on resolution. The cemetery in the mid-19th century, during its period of active use, would have looked substantially different from what a visitor finds today. The clearing that held the burial ground was then at the edge of farmland, the tree line of visible boundary rather than the enclosure it has since become, the path from the road not yet a winding channel through dense second growth, but a more open route across maintained agricultural territory. The families whose names were on the markers were still present in the surrounding area, still farming, still attending to the grounds as part of the practical and social maintenance of their community. A cleared plot at the edge of farmland, maintained by the people who used it, carries a different aspect than an overgrown woodland clearing. There would have been a regularity to the grounds, paths tended, markers upright or restored when they fell, vegetation managed at the boundaries. The cemetery, as it existed during the decades of active family maintenance, was a working part of the community that surrounded it, not a relic. The slow change began in the latter decades of the 19th century and continued through the first decades of the 20th, as the farming community that had established the cemetery dispersed or died without successors in the immediate area, and as the organized maintenance of the grounds became harder to sustain. This process is not unusual in rural cemetery history. Communities move, families die out or relocate to cities. The economic pressures of agricultural life shift the demographics of a region over a generation or two, and the cemeteries that served those communities are left behind, legally protected in many cases from development, but practically without anyone to maintain them. The graves remain, the markers remain, or some of them do. The vegetation, having no opposition, begins to move. By the mid-20th century, with no organized body maintaining the grounds after the dispersal and death of the founding families, Bachelor's Grove had been effectively abandoned as an active burial site. The last burials recorded at the cemetery date to the 1960s, and with no new interments to prompt maintenance and no family organization remaining to oversee the grounds, the vegetation began in earnest its work of reclamation. Oak and hickory saplings established themselves along the edges of the cleared area. Grass and low vegetation crossed the maintained boundaries and spread across the paths between markers. The path from the Midlothian Turnpike, once an open route through managed agricultural land, became the winding woodland channel through second-growth forest that it is today, and the markers, the limestone slabs and carved stones that the founding families had placed and maintained over more than a century of use, began to lean and fall without anyone to restore them, some disappearing under new growth, others breaking along old frost cracks where no one came to set them right again. What the vegetation does to a cemetery, it has been given decades to work on, is gradual and thorough, and in its way quite complete. A path becomes indistinct. The leaf litter covers the low spaces between markers, and the markers themselves begin to read as part of the ground rather than interruptions of it. Growth crosses the cleared boundaries, and the boundary itself, once a visible line between maintained ground and natural woodland, ceases to be a boundary in any practical sense and becomes simply a zone of transition, forest on one side, something that is slowly becoming forest on the other. A marker disappears under new growth, not dramatically, but incrementally, season by season, each year's leaf fall adding a little more, each winter's frost and thaw settling the earth a little differently, until the carved surface is flush with or below the ground level, and the name on it is reading only to the roots. In the early 1960s, as the formal period of active use ended and the vegetation began its advance in earnest, the cemetery that the Fulton and Ritter families and their neighbors had established more than 100 years before was entering a new phase of its existence, no longer maintained, no longer added to, no longer a working part of any community's present life, but still there, still holding its dead, still legible in its stones to anyone who walked the quarter-mile path from the Midlothian Turnpike and gave the grounds their attention. The marks that the founding families had left, the names carved into limestone, the dates that anchored specific lives to specific years, the brief phrases in the funerary language of the rural Midwest were being asked to last on their own now, without maintenance, in a climate that is not kind to soft stone and in terrain that is not kind to upright markers. The oak and hickory canopy overhead in the early morning holds the light at a particular angle before the sun has climbed high enough to reach the clearing directly. The ground in this low-lying terrain collects moisture through the night and releases it slowly, and in the cooler months, a thin layer of mist sits at knee height above the leaf litter, drifting between the surviving markers without urgency. The woodland smell in this season is specific, damp earth and old leaves, and the mineral coolness of standing water, not far away, and it is the smell of a place that has been left to itself for long enough that the natural processes of the terrain have reasserted their authority over any marks that human activity made in the ground. The marks are still there. The terrain has simply resumed its own work around them, and in the early morning, with the mist low and the light filtered through the canopy, the cemetery exists in a condition that is neither ruin nor preservation, but something between the two, held in place by the stone and the law, slowly absorbed by the ground and the trees. The limestone markers that the founding families placed in the 1840s and 1850s were a practical choice for the period in the region. Limestone is locally available in Cook County's geological substrate. It is workable by the stone carvers of the rural Midwest who produced grave markers for farming communities throughout the area, and it holds a carved inscription well enough when freshly cut that the lettering is clear and crisp and entirely legible in the year of installation. What limestone does less well is resist the particular combination of moisture and frost that characterizes northern Illinois winters, and what a century and a half of such winters does to a soft limestone marker is visible in the survivors at Bachelor's Grove. Rounded edges, softened lettering, the faces of the stones beginning to spall in layers where the freeze-thaw cycle has gotten into the substrate and expanded it. The stones are still there. The names are still mostly readable, but the material is in a process of very slow return to the landscape it came from, and without intervention, that process continues on its own terms. The founding families of Bachelor's Grove, the Fultons, the Ritters, and the other names that appear on the markers from the earliest decades of the cemetery's use, were people of a kind that the rural Midwest produced in significant numbers during the period of its agricultural settlement. European immigrants and their children, farming people, practical and rooted in the specific geography of the land they had cleared and planted and built on. They established their cemetery with the same practical intent with which they established everything else, as a working institution serving a working community located where it needed to be, maintained by the people who used it, organized according to the conventions of their time and place. The cemetery they built has outlasted the community that built it, as cemeteries often do. The markers they placed have outlasted the organized care that would have kept them upright and legible, as markers sometimes do not. What remains is a record, partial, damaged, still partly readable, of the people who were here first. A walk through the grounds in the early morning, the mist low, and the light filtering through the oak and hickory canopy produces a particular experience of reading that record. The surviving markers present themselves at irregular intervals, some upright and legible, some tilted and readable with effort, some fallen and readable only to someone willing to kneel in the wet leaf litter and look. The cluster of Fulton markers in their corner of the cemetery presents several decades of one family's presence in a single glance, stones from the 1840s and stones from 30 and 40 years later, standing together in the way family members share a space, at different heights and in different states of weathering, all carrying the same name. The earliest stones in the cemetery carry dates that are now more than 170 years in the past, which is long enough for the world those dates belonged to be not just gone, but genuinely distant. A different Illinois, a different Cook County, a different relationship between this particular piece of wooded terrain and the people who lived near it and used it. The path that connects the Midlothian Turnpike to the cemetery grounds runs its quarter-mile through terrain that was farmland when the cemetery was established and is woodland now. The trees that line it on both sides are second growth, not old-growth forest that predates settlement, but the forest that grew back after settlement's agricultural period ended, and the land was left to return to what it had been before the clearing. In the time since the surrounding agricultural use ended, and the forest preserve absorbed the area, the second-growth woodland has had decades to develop its canopy and its understory, and the path through it now has the quality of a path through established woodland, rather than the more open character it would have had when the surrounding land was farmed and the cemetery was in regular use. The compression of the quarter-mile walk, the sound of traffic on the turnpike dropping away in the first 100 yards, the light shifting from the open sky of the road to the filtered green of the canopy, is a function of this woodland's particular density, the product of decades of unmanaged growth. The Rubio Woods Forest Preserve, of which the Bachelor's Grove Cemetery grounds now form a small and distinctive part, encompasses the kind of mixed hardwood terrain that was characteristic of the Chicago region's wooded areas before settlement. Oak and hickory dominate the canopy in the areas around the cemetery. The ground is low-lying enough in this part of the preserve that standing water and seasonal wet areas are features of the landscape for much of the year, and the lagoon adjacent to the cemetery, a body of standing water that occupies a depression in the terrain, is fed by this general low-lying moisture and by the drainage patterns of the surrounding land. In the cooler months, the lagoon produces the ground-level mist that settles into the cemetery grounds, and the path from the road, the moisture rising from the relatively warmer water surface into the cooler air and drifting through the wooded margin that separates the lagoon from the cemetery clearing. On mornings when this mist is present, the grounds have a quality of soft-edged visibility, things seen at a short distance remaining clear, the distances beyond that becoming uncertain, the tree line at the far edge of the clearing reading as a suggestion rather than a definite boundary. There is a quality specific to places that have been used and then left, a quality that cemeteries develop more completely than most kinds of place, because the use they were designed for is permanent, and the leaving of the living does not undo the presence of the dead. The Fulton and Ritter families and their neighbors, buried at Bachelor's Grove across the decades of the 19th century, are as present in the ground now as they were when the last of their descendants, to maintain the grounds, made their final visit. The cemetery has not been abandoned in the complete sense of the word. It has simply lost its active human community. The people who would have come regularly maintained the markers, kept the paths clear, known each stone by name. What it has now instead is the attention of visitors, researchers, historians, members of the public who make the quarter-mile walk for various reasons, and the slow, thorough attention of the woodland, which has been working on the grounds since the 1960s with the patient indifference of natural process. By the late 1960s, the visible evidence of that process was already substantial. Vegetation had crossed the cleared boundaries of the original cemetery layout and was advancing across the grounds. Paths that had been kept clear through regular maintenance were becoming difficult to trace, the distinction between path and non-path blurring as the ground cover spread. Markers that had leaned without being corrected had begun to fall, and markers that had been standing were beginning to lean. The original layout of the grounds, the arrangement of family plots, the orientation of markers, the organization of the space that the founding families had established and maintained, was becoming progressively harder to read from a casual inspection of the grounds. A visitor to the cemetery in 1968 or 1970 would have found a place in a condition of visible transition, caught between the human order it had been designed to maintain and the natural process that was steadily absorbing it. This transition is not unusual in the history of rural cemeteries, and it is not in itself a cause for particular alarm or grief. The communities that established these cemeteries established them because they needed them, maintained them because maintenance was a practical expression of care for the dead and for the community's sense of its own continuity, and eventually left them behind because communities change and disperse, and the continuity breaks. What is left when that happens is the ground, and the stones, and the names, partial records of the people who were there, held in whatever condition the material and the weather and the succeeding decades produce. At Bachelor's Grove, the records that have survived are fragmentary and damaged, and in some cases no longer legible, but they are still there. The cemetery is still there. The Fulton plot in its corner of the clearing still carries its several generations of the same surname, in markers that are various degrees of upright and legible and weathered. The limestone slabs from the 1840s still hold their carved letters, imperfectly but recognizably. In the early morning, with the oak and hickory canopy overhead, and the mist low above the leaf litter, and the sound of the Midlothian turnpike traffic already inaudible, a quarter-mile back down the path, the cemetery presents itself as what it is: a small, historically documented burial ground established by farming families in 1844 in the wooded terrain of Bremen Township, Cook County, Illinois, used for more than 100 years, abandoned as an active site in the 1960s, and left to the slow work of the woodland since. The names on the markers are real names, the dates are real dates. The families who placed the markers were real families who lived and farmed and died in this specific part of Illinois, and were buried here in this particular clearing in what is now a forest preserve, in limestone graves that have been sitting in this low-lying terrain through 170 winters. The ground has shifted around some of them. The forest has advanced across the boundaries of the cleared space they were placed in. New growth has covered some of them, and weather has softened the letters on others, and the organized care that would have kept all of them upright and legible ended in the years when the last of the maintaining families dispersed. The cemetery, as it entered the 1960s, vegetation crossing the cleared boundaries, a path becoming indistinct, a marker tilting toward the leaf litter with no one coming to correct it, was a place in the process of being absorbed back into the landscape that surrounded it, not violently and not quickly, the way all things that are built and then left eventually return to the ground at the pace of the particular materials involved and the particular climate doing the work. A limestone marker in northern Illinois has a certain number of winters in it before the frost-thaw cycle has done enough to the stone that the letters begin to disappear. The paths at Bachelor's Grove had a certain number of growing seasons in them before the ground cover advanced far enough across them that the path ceased to be a distinct feature of the landscape and became simply a part of the woodland floor. The cleared boundary of the cemetery had a certain number of decades in it before the tree line moved far enough inward that the clearing ceased to read as a clearing and became an irregularity in the forest, a space of different density and different ground cover, but surrounded rather than bounded by the trees. This is what a cemetery looks like when the community that created it has dispersed and the natural processes of the terrain have resumed. It is a condition that the historical record documents without drama: the dispersal of families, the ending of active use, the beginning of the forest preserve era, the vegetation advancing season by season across the grounds. The names on the stones are still there, for the most part, in varying degrees of legibility. The ground has simply resumed its own work around them, and the forest has grown up to hold the space in its canopy and its understory and its seasonal mist. The cemetery persists in the way that things persist when they are made of stone and set into the ground and left to endure what the weather and the years produce, quietly, at a remove as a fact of time rather than a cause for particular sorrow. The founding families of Bachelor's Grove rest in the ground they chose, in the limestone graves their community placed them in a small clearing in the Rubio Woods Forest Preserve, at the end of a narrow, unpaved path that runs a quarter-mile from the Midlothian Turnpike into the second-growth woodland, where the sound of the road drops away within the first 100 yards, and the oak and hickory canopy closes in overhead. And the mist, on mornings when the lagoon is warmer than the air, sits low above the leaf litter between the surviving markers, and the trees continue their slow advance across the boundaries of the ground that the families once maintained. The path from the Midlothian Turnpike runs roughly a quarter of a mile into the forest before it reaches the cemetery entrance, and on an evening in early October, when the light has already begun dropping out of the sky by 5 o'clock, that walk takes a person through several distinct changes in the quality of the surrounding air. The traffic noise from the road fades within the first 100 yards. The tree canopy overhead closes in from both sides, the oak and hickory growth of the Rubio Woods Forest Preserve pressing toward the path from left and right, and the open sky above narrows to a corridor of gray. By the time the cemetery entrance comes into view, the evening feels older than it did at the road. The light that reaches the ground here is what has made it through the canopy, and in October, that is not much. It was along this path, on one of those October evenings, that a witness reported seeing something in the wooded margin to the right of the trail that stopped them mid-step. The account was one of several gathered by Chicago area paranormal researcher Richard Crow, who spent decades documenting eyewitness testimony from the Bachelor's Grove area. What the witness described was not movement, not a sound, not a figure. What they described was a building, a small white structure, 2 stories tall, standing in the wooded margin, perhaps 200 yards from the path. A front porch with wooden railings, a pitched roof, shuttered windows on the upper floor, and on the lower floor, warm light visible from within, the kind of warm, steady light that comes from a lamp in a room where someone is home. The witness stopped and looked at it. From that distance, in that light, there was nothing unusual about it. A farmhouse, set back from a path at the edge of the woods, with the lights on inside. Nothing that would cause a person to stop, except for the knowledge carried by anyone who had read anything about Bachelor's Grove before arriving, that there was no farmhouse there, no structure of any kind, no building documented on any current map, no foundation visible in any survey of the grounds, no record of demolition, just the tree line and the open air between it and the path, and on this particular evening, a white house standing in that space, as though it had always been there. The witness moved toward it. This is the part of the account that every eyewitness report of the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse shares, the detail that distinguishes it from a simple misidentification of a distant structure or a trick of failing light. As the witness moved toward the house did not remain stationary. It retreated, not quickly, not with any obvious motion. The structure did not dissolve or shimmer or move in any way that would identify it as moving. It simply maintained its distance. 3 steps toward it produced 3 steps of recession. The space between the observer and the building held constant, or very nearly so, regardless of how quickly or slowly the observer moved. In no account gathered by Crow, and in no subsequent documented report, has any witness described successfully closing that distance. No one has reported reaching the porch steps. No one has reported touching the railing. The house keeps its remove, and eventually, in most accounts, after the witness has covered a significant distance through the undergrowth or simply stopped advancing, it is no longer there. Richard Crow's documentation of these accounts extended across several decades of field research in the greater Chicago area, and the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse represented, within his collected testimony, one of the most consistently described phenomena he encountered at any single location. Crow treated consistency of physical description as a significant data point, not as confirmation, but as something worth noting carefully and tracking across accounts from different time periods and different witnesses. The farmhouse accounts held their shape across that tracking in ways that Crow found worth recording. The structure was always described as white. It was always described as wood frame. It was always 2 stories. The porch was always part of the description. The warm interior light appeared in accounts separated by years and decades, described by people with no documented connection to one another, using the same quiet domestic detail, a lamp on in a room, the suggestion of habitation, of someone inside the house going about an ordinary evening. The light is a detail worth dwelling on. It is not described as strange light. It is not cold or blue or flickering in any way that would suggest something anomalous. Witnesses have consistently described it as warm, in the sense of color temperature, the amber-orange glow of incandescent light or firelight, the kind of light that communicates from a distance that a house is occupied. It reads, at 200 yards through the October dusk, as entirely ordinary. This is part of what the accounts consistently record about the first moment of sighting. There is nothing about the house in that initial observation that signals anything unusual. It looks like a house. It looks like a house with someone home. The atmospheric conditions under which the farmhouse has most frequently been reported are specific and consistent enough to be worth describing in some detail. Sightings have been concentrated under conditions of transitional light, the hour around dusk, the hour around dawn, and overcast daytime conditions, in which the flat, diffuse quality of the light makes distances harder to read and the edges of things less certain. Fog has also been documented as a frequent feature of sighting conditions. The Bachelor's Grove Lagoon, which sits adjacent to the cemetery grounds and is fed by the low-lying hydrology of the Rubio Woods terrain, produces ground-level mist under standard conditions of temperature differential, warmer water surface, cooler air, particularly in the autumn months when the air temperature drops faster than the water temperature. That mist drifts across the open ground between the lagoon and the cemetery margin, collecting in the low areas, moving through the tree line, and spreading across the field margin where the farmhouse is most often reported. On a still October evening, this is not unusual mist. It sits at knee height above the leaf litter, thin and gray, softening the lower portions of the tree line and making the open ground between the path and the trees look wider and less defined than it does in clear conditions. There is no question that the Midlothian Turnpike corridor, along which the path to Bachelor's Grove runs, is topographically prone to this kind of mist formation. The low-lying terrain, the presence of standing water in the lagoon, and the surrounding forest cover that limits wind and traps moisture near the surface all contribute to conditions in which ground fog forms readily and persists through the evening hours. These are documented environmental features of the location, consistent across seasons and independent of any account of unusual phenomena. What the environmental conditions produce, on a practical level, is exactly the kind of light and visibility that makes identification of distant objects unreliable. A tree line seen through thin fog at dusk, from a distance of several hundred yards, is not the same object as a tree line seen in clear afternoon light from 50 feet. The edges soften, the distances flatten. The relationship between objects, which is closer, which is farther, which is moving, and which is still, becomes difficult to read with confidence. Researchers proposing naturalistic explanations for the farmhouse sightings have focused heavily on this environmental context, and it is a serious and considered position that the atmospheric conditions at the Bachelor's Grove Lagoon margin are precisely the conditions under which the human visual system is most susceptible to misinterpretation of ambiguous distant forms. At the same time, the accounts themselves note these conditions. Witnesses who have reported the farmhouse have often described the mist, the low light, the difficulty of seeing clearly into the tree line. They have described, in other words, the same environmental context that a skeptical investigator would identify as explanatory. The witnesses were aware of the reduced visibility. They have still, in the majority of accounts, described the farmhouse as clearly visible, clearly white, clearly structured with a porch and railings and a pitched roof and windows with light behind them. The mist and the low light in the accounts do not account for the specificity of what is described. The field at the edge of the cemetery, in the last light of an October day, when the ground fog has begun rising from the lagoon and the tree line has started to lose definition in the failing light, is a particular kind of place. The color drains out of it unevenly, the darker values of the tree trunks and the wet leaf litter going first, the paler surfaces holding light a little longer. A white structure would hold light longer still. This is the physics of it, the simple optics of pale surfaces in low light, and it is not a trivial point when thinking about the conditions under which the farmhouse is reported. A white two-story structure at 200 yards in October dusk in the Midlothian Turnpike corridor would be among the last things visible as the light failed, it would hold its shape in the eye when the surrounding context had already dissolved into gray. Whether this optical persistence explains what witnesses have described, or whether it describes the conditions under which something genuinely unusual has been observed, is a question that evidence has not resolved. Cook County historical records offer a partial frame for the farmhouse reports, and the frame is worth tracing carefully because it neither confirms nor dismisses the accounts, but holds them in a useful middle ground. Plat maps of the Bachelor's Grove area from the mid to late 19th century document the parceling of agricultural land in the immediate vicinity of the cemetery. Bremen Township, in which Bachelor's Grove sits, was settled farming country in the decades following the 1830s, and the land adjacent to and surrounding the cemetery was in active agricultural use throughout the mid to late 19th century. Farms in this period meant farmhouses, and farmhouses in rural Cook County in this period meant exactly the kind of structure the eyewitness accounts describe. Small wood frame, 2 stories, a front porch, wooden railings, a pitched roof. This was the standard vernacular architecture of the rural Midwest in the 1850s through the 1880s, and the agricultural parcels adjacent to Bachelor's Grove would have carried structures of this type. General Land Office survey records from the same period and historical township atlases that documented property improvements and structures are part of the documentary record that researchers have examined in attempting to locate a specific farmhouse footprint at the site where sightings are concentrated. The examination of this material is real work, not speculation. It involves tracing property lines across successive map editions, identifying when improvements appear and disappear from the record, and comparing the historical footprints of documented structures against the spatial coordinates that emerge from the witness accounts. Researchers who have done this work have found that the area adjacent to the cemetery was indeed developed with farmhouses and outbuildings during the period of most active agricultural use. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute, what has not been resolved, is whether any documented structure from that period can be placed with confidence at the specific location where the apparition is most commonly reported. No surviving foundation has been identified at that location. No demolition record has been matched to a structure of the described type at those coordinates. The documentary record confirms that farmhouses existed in the general area. It does not confirm the placement of a specific farmhouse at the specific site. This is the gap the historical record leaves open, and it is a genuine gap, not a smoking gun in either direction, but an honest absence of definitive documentation. There is a particular quality to looking for something in a historical record and finding the edges of it, but not the thing itself. A researcher tracing Cook County plat maps on a research table, running a finger along the faint handwritten property lines of an agricultural parcel, can establish that the land adjacent to the cemetery was farmed, that structures stood on it, that those structures have since been demolished or have disappeared from the record. The researcher can establish all of this with confidence. What the researcher cannot establish, what the maps do not show, what the survey records do not confirm, is the specific placement, the specific footprint, the specific building that would close the gap between the historical record and what witnesses have described standing in the wooded margin at dusk. On a clear afternoon, the field margin adjacent to the Bachelor's Grove Cemetery entrance reads as exactly what it is: a space of open ground between the path and the tree line, roughly 200 yards wide at its broadest point, the grass and low scrub of the forest preserve understory covering ground that was once farmland. The tree line at the far edge of this space is distinct and readable. The distance between the path and the trees is easy to judge. Nothing appears in that space that is not there. On an overcast October afternoon, when the pale, flat light of a cloudy sky has removed the shadows that give objects their readable depth, the same space is harder to navigate visually. The far edge of the clearing becomes difficult to read. The tree line and the open space between it and the path blend into an indistinct surface, a gray-green wall that offers the eye fewer reference points for judging distance or distinguishing one element from another. This is not a trivial visual effect. The flattening of visual depth under overcast light is a documented perceptual phenomenon, well understood in terms of visual neuroscience, and the Midlothian Turnpike corridor under overcast autumn conditions produces it reliably. Researchers who have proposed pareidolia as a partial explanation for the farmhouse sightings, the tendency of the visual system to resolve ambiguous shapes into recognizable forms, particularly forms loaded with cultural meaning, have pointed to these atmospheric conditions as precisely the context in which pareidolia operates most powerfully. A pale rectangular form in the visual periphery, seen through fog at the edge of failing light, is exactly the kind of ambiguous input that the visual system is prone to resolving into a building. The warm light in the windows, in this reading, is the visual system completing a pattern from incomplete input. It is a serious reading, and it accounts for some of what is described in the accounts. Whether it accounts for all of it, for the specificity of the porch railings, the shuttered upper windows, the pitched roof, the warm and steady light, is a question the research has not settled. There is also the recession. The defining feature of the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse accounts is not the appearance of the structure, but its behavior, the way it maintains its distance as a witness advances toward it. Pareidolia does not easily account for this. A misidentified shape in the visual field, when approached, would resolve into its component parts: a pale tree, a patch of pale sky, a fragment of reflected light. It would not maintain its apparent form at a consistent distance as the observer moved toward it. The recession is the part of the account that sits most uncomfortably with the standard visual misidentification explanation, and it is the part that researchers on both sides of the question have spent the most time with. One partial explanation that has been proposed involves the way fog interacts with light and with the observer's own movement through it. Ground fog at the lagoon margin is not uniform. It is thicker in the low areas and thinner on higher ground, and as an observer moves through it, the visual field around them shifts in ways that can affect the apparent position of objects at the far edge of the fog layer. A pale form seen at the far edge of a fog bank as the observer moves toward it might appear to maintain its distance simply because the observer is moving through the denser portion of the fog, while the form sits at the far edge where the fog thins, the apparent distance held constant by the changing density of the intervening medium rather than by any movement of the form itself. This is a plausible mechanism under specific atmospheric conditions. Whether those conditions were present in each of the sighting accounts is unknown, because the accounts do not consistently document the precise character of the fog at the time of the sighting. What the accounts consistently document across the decades of reported sightings that Crow gathered and that subsequent researchers have added to is the experience of advancing toward the house and finding the distance unchanged. The witnesses describe this without uniform language. Some note it with surprise, some with a quality that reads in the written accounts closer to resignation, as though the recession was expected even as it was still strange. The structure holds its distance. The porch, the railings, the warm light in the downstairs window, the pitched roof All of it holds at the same remove as the observer advances. And then, at some point that differs across accounts, the house is simply gone. The tray line is there. The open ground between the path and the trees is there. The fog, if it was present, is still drifting across the low ground. The house is not. The earliest concentrated body of documentation for the farmhouse phenomenon, in the form that it is now recognized, the specific physical description, the recession behavior, the specific location relative to the cemetery, comes from mid-20th century accounts, though researchers have noted references in older local tradition that may correspond to earlier versions of the same phenomenon. The accounts that Crow documented were drawn from a period spanning several decades, and his work represented the most systematic effort to gather, date, and compare the individual reports that had accumulated around the site. What Crow's documentation shows, when the accounts are laid out chronologically, is that the physical description holds with unusual stability across time. Witnesses separated by decades describe the same white two-story structure with the same architectural features. They describe the same warm light. They describe the recession with the same basic phenomenology, the distance maintained, the structure retreating, the eventual disappearance. The accounts differ in their details and in their framings, as independent accounts from independent witnesses inevitably will. But the core of what is described has a consistency that researchers on multiple sides of the question have noted, even where they differ on what that consistency implies. The warm light in the window is the detail that stays longest after the other details have been considered and weighed. It is the detail that places the house, in the first moment of sighting, in the category of the ordinary. A house with a lamp on inside is a house where someone is home. It is the most domestic of signals, the most immediately readable, the one that says, this is a place where people live. The witnesses who stopped on the path and looked toward the tree line in the October dusk were not looking at something that announced itself as strange. They were looking at a house at the edge of a field, at the end of an October day, with the lights on inside. The strangeness came later, with the advancing and the recession, with the disappearance. The first moment was simply a house. The Cook County plat map, spread on a research table, its faint handwritten property lines tracing the agricultural parcels of Bremen Township in the 1850s and 1860s, tells its own version of this story. The land adjacent to Bachelor's Grove was farmed. Structures stood there. The families whose names are on the grave markers in the cemetery were the same families who worked that land, who built the farmhouses, who lit the lamps inside them at the end of an October day. The farms are gone now. The families are gone. The structures have left no confirmed footprint in the ground at the specific location where witnesses have placed the house in the tree line's margin. But the plat maps hold the outlines of the parcels, the handwritten names of the owners, the documented evidence that this was once working farmland, with working farmhouses on it, and that those farmhouses looked, in the standard vernacular architecture of mid-19th century rural Illinois, very much like what witnesses have described. Whether what witnesses have seen is a surviving imprint of something that once stood there, a misidentification produced by the specific atmospheric conditions of the lagoon corridor on an autumn evening, a phenomenon the existing investigative and scientific frameworks have not yet adequately described, or something else that the current evidentiary record does not clearly support. None of these questions has been resolved. The historical record places farmhouses in the general area. The historical record does not place a specific farmhouse at the specific location. The witness accounts place a specific farmhouse there with specific detail. The accounts span decades and come from witnesses with no documented prior contact with each other. The farmhouse, in every account, retreats. There is a specificity to the architectural description in these accounts that is worth pausing on because it tells something about the period the structure is associated with, even if it does not confirm the structure's origin. A small white wood frame two-story house with a front porch, wooden railings, a pitched roof, and shuttered windows is not a building from any period after the early 20th century. It is not a building from the suburb that surrounded and eventually absorbed much of Bremen Township in the latter decades of the 20th century. It is a building from the mid to late 19th century, from the period when the farming families of Bachelor's Grove settlement were building their homes and burying their dead in the small clearing at the edge of the woodland. Whether that correspondence between the period of the cemetery and the period suggested by the building's architecture carries any evidentiary weight, or whether it is simply a function of cultural expectation, witnesses associating the cemetery with its historical period and projecting that association into what they report, is a question that the accounts alone cannot resolve. The overcast October afternoon view of the field margin, the pale flat light, the indistinct boundary between open ground and tree line, the gray-green wall of the far edge reading without depth or definition, holds a kind of visual patience. Standing at the path's edge in that light, looking across the field toward the tree line 200 yards away, is not a frightening experience. It is a looking experience. The visual field offers a question. What is there at the far edge of the clearing that cannot be quite read? The October light answers that question ambiguously. The tree line is there. The open ground between is there. The distances are difficult to judge. Whether anything else is there is a question the light declines to answer with confidence. That is, in a sense, the quality of the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse accounts when examined carefully. They offer a consistent description, a consistent behavior, a consistent atmospheric context. They span decades. They come from witnesses who are in the majority of documented cases encountering the phenomenon without prior extensive knowledge of the specific details, knowing the general reputation of the site, but not the specific architectural description that they subsequently produce independently and in correspondence with earlier accounts. The accounts are a body of evidence in the sense that any systematic collection of consistent eyewitness testimony constitutes evidence of something having occurred. What they are evidence of has not been established. The light fades at the Bachelor's Grove field margin earlier than it fades at the road, because the canopy overhead intercepts the last of the sky's light before it reaches the ground. By the time a visitor walking the quarter-mile path from the Midlothian Turnpike has reached the cemetery entrance, the evening at ground level is already ahead of the evening at the road. The fog, when it forms first here in the low ground near the lagoon, where the water surface holds its warmth into the cooling air and the moisture rises and drifts. On the evenings when the mist is thick enough, the lower portions of the tree line dissolve into it, and the open ground between the path and the trees is covered in a layer of white that sits at knee height, still and slow moving, catching what little light is left in the sky. In those conditions, at that hour, the field margin is the kind of place where a pale rectangular form at the far edge of the fog layer would be among the last things visible before the light failed entirely. It would hold its shape when the surrounding context had already gone to gray. It would read from 200 yards as a structure, 2 stories, a porch, a pitched roof, warm light in the lower windows. It would look in the last of the October light like a house with someone home. No building has been definitively placed there by the historical record. No foundation has been found. No demolished structure has been matched to the location. The Cook County Survey records and the General Land Office plats document farmhouses in the vicinity, on the parcels adjacent to the cemetery, on the land that the founding families of Bachelor's Grove worked and left and eventually surrendered to the process of time and community dispersal that left the cemetery itself without a maintaining body. But the specific footprint, the specific location, the specific structure that would close the gap between the historical record and the accounts, that has not been found. The question sits in the Cook County Historical Archive, in the gap between what the plat maps show and what the witnesses have described, and it has been sitting there without resolution for as long as the accounts have been gathered. The field is still there. The tree line is still there. The tree line is still there. The lagoon is still there, still producing its ground-level mist on cool autumn evenings when the water surface is warmer than the air. The path from the Midlothian Turnpike still runs its quarter-mile through the canopy, and somewhere in the documented record, in the files that Richard Crowe kept across decades of field research, the accounts of the farmhouse are still there too, gathered and noted, compared and held, the physical description consistent, the recession consistent, the disappearance consistent, and the explanation still, quietly and genuinely, absent. In the last seconds before the shutter closed on the infrared camera, the cemetery was quiet and dark and entirely measurably empty in that direction. No team member had positioned themselves near the grave markers at the center of the frame. No member of the Ghost Research Society investigation had walked into that field of view in the moments before the photograph was taken. The camera was raised, the frame composed against the pale limestone and the surrounding dark, and the shutter fell on whatever the film would later hold inside it. That was in August of 1991, on a night warm enough that the investigators had moved through the cemetery without jackets, the summer air still and thick in the wooded enclosure, the older grave markers catching what little ambient light filtered through the canopy overhead. The Ghost Research Society had been conducting formal field research at Bachelor's Grove for some time by then, logging observations, recording equipment readings, documenting the accounts of witnesses who had come forward over the years with reports of what they had seen at the site. Dale Kuzmarek, who led the organization and its investigations, had developed a methodical approach to the work, not merely collecting stories, but establishing systematic documentation, the kind of accumulated record that allows researchers to look back across years and find, where it exists, a pattern. The August investigation was one entry in that record. The photograph that Mary Huff developed afterward became, and has remained, the one piece of evidence from Bachelor's Grove that researchers in this field continue to cite most often and resolve least completely. The print, held under examination light, shows a grave marker at the center of the frame. Sitting on that marker is a figure. The figure appears to be female, clothed in what researchers described as period dress, seated in a posture that is unhurried and composed, as though the grave marker were simply a place to rest. What makes the photograph difficult to set aside is not the figure's presence, but its particular quality. The stone surface of the marker is partially visible through her form, not fully blocked, not fully interrupted, the two things occupying the same space in a way that a physically present person would not permit. The figure is not opaque. She does not quite resolve into solid fact when studied. The image is clear enough to examine carefully, and after careful examination, not clear enough to fully explain. Skeptical analysts reviewing the photograph have proposed a range of explanations considered in the photographic and investigative literature: double exposure, unintentional film exposure, processing artifacts, and the particular way infrared film renders skin tones and light fabrics, which can produce translucent or luminous effects that standard film does not. These explanations are part of the evidentiary record and are documented alongside the photograph itself. What they have not collectively produced is a single account that a consensus of researchers, including skeptical researchers, has accepted as fully satisfying. The photograph remains in circulation. The figure remains on the stone. What Huff's photograph documents in one still image, the wider body of witness, accounts from Bachelor's Grove, distributes across decades and across the full extent of the grounds. The accounts differ in their particulars and overlap in their structure. They come from individuals who visited the site in different years, under different conditions, with different expectations about what they might find there. What they reported tends to cluster around a small number of recurring figures, specific enough in description that researchers have given some of them names drawn from the accounts themselves, names that function as shorthand for a type of sighting rather than as identifiers of any historically documented individual. The figure most commonly named in the Bachelor's Grove literature is the White Lady. Across multiple independent accounts, witnesses have described a translucent female figure dressed in white, moving through the cemetery on moonlit nights along a path that follows no particular route between the surviving markers. Some accounts include a child or an infant in her arms. None of the accounts report the figure acknowledging the presence of witnesses. She moves along her path, or along what appears, from the witness's position, to be a path, and she fades before she reaches any clear destination. The accounts do not describe a dramatic disappearance. They describe a gradual loss of visibility, as though something that was present a moment ago is simply by degrees no longer there. She has been observed near the older section of the cemetery's surviving markers, in the area of clearest ground, on nights when the moon is full enough to make the limestone appear almost luminous against the surrounding dark. No account in the documented record describes her doing anything that could be read as threatening. She is simply moving, and then she is not. The traditions associated with her are older than the formal investigations. Multiple researchers have noted that accounts of the White Lady at Bachelor's Grove predate the site's reputation as a location for paranormal inquiry, appearing in local tradition well before the investigations of the 1970s and 1980s drew more systematic attention to the site. This distinction matters to researchers examining the account pool because a figure that appears in testimony predating organized interest in a location is considered differently than one that emerges after the location has become associated with paranormal activity, and its mythology has had time to spread and self-reinforce. The White Lady's presence in earlier accounts does not establish her as real in any sense that evidence can confirm. It places her earlier in the record. The two things are not the same, and researchers have been careful to note the difference. A full moon night at Bachelor's Grove, standing at the edge of the main clearing in the direction the White Lady accounts most often situate her, would give a witness the following view: white limestone grave markers catching the moonlight at varying angles, depending on how they have settled into the softening earth over the course of a century and more, their carved inscriptions alternately bright and shadowed, the open paths between them running a few feet wide and then narrowing where vegetation has advanced and has not been cut back, the tree line at the perimeter standing as a solid dark border with no visible depth beyond it, the overhead canopy intermittently breaking the moonlight into smaller pale shapes that move across the ground when any wind moves through the upper branches. In that light, at that hour, distances compress. Objects at the far end of the clearing are less clearly defined than they appear to be. The surviving markers are numerous enough that the eye, tracking from one to the next, can briefly lose the count of the shapes it is parsing. This is not an explanation for the White Lady accounts. It is the documented physical context inside which those accounts were produced. The two things coexist without resolving each other. The same full moon that catches the limestone would, on a clear night, also illuminate the path from the cemetery toward the lagoon at Bachelor's Grove, the narrow route that runs from the main grounds down through the lower-lying terrain to the edge of the standing water. Witnesses have described a distinct figure along that path as well, hooded, moving close to the water's edge, maintaining no consistent distance from observers, the way the farmhouse accounts describe, simply present, and then, in subsequent moments, absent. The lagoon path accounts are not as numerous as the White Lady accounts, and they are not as consistent in their specific details. They share a general structure, a figure near the water, observed briefly, gone before any closer approach resolves the observation into certainty. But the particulars vary enough across accounts that researchers have been cautious about treating them as a single documented entity rather than a cluster of separate experiences with a shared setting. The path toward the lagoon is lower, darker, and less open than the main cemetery clearing. What can and cannot be resolved at night in that terrain is a different question than what can be resolved in the more open ground above. Other figures reported at Bachelor's Grove over the years are less frequently cited in the literature, but appear in the compiled account records with enough specificity to be worth noting as part of the full documented range. A large man in 19th century clothing has been placed near the older grave markers by multiple witnesses from different time periods. His size and his dress described in terms that suggest the accounts may be drawing on the same observation rather than producing it independently, though researchers note that the degree of resemblance across accounts could also reflect cultural transmission of a legend that then shapes the way subsequent witnesses interpret ambiguous perceptions. And there is the figure that appears in a smaller number of accounts, but that researchers have found difficult to categorize alongside the others, described as glowing, moving through the wooded perimeter of the cemetery at night, and possessing what witnesses have described in their attempts to articulate something they appear to have found genuinely difficult to describe, an anomalous doubling of the upper body, as though the figure's proportions did not conform to the proportions of a person. This account exists in the record. Researchers have noted it. No proposed explanation, conventional or otherwise, has been advanced with any confidence. The figure is simply there in the accounts, occupying a category the investigators have left, thus far, unnamed. The Ghost Research Society's 1991 investigation brought instruments to Bears Grove that have become standard in the field, including electromagnetic field meters, devices that measure variations in the local electromagnetic environment, and flag readings that depart from the ambient baseline. An EMF meter in an environment with no conventional electrical infrastructure will typically produce a baseline reading near zero. Departure from that baseline in a location away from power lines, appliances, wiring, and any other conventional EM source is considered an anomaly that the investigation should note and, where possible, account for. At Bachelor's Grove in August of 1991, the investigators found anomalous readings in specific zones, not spread evenly across the grounds, but concentrated near clusters of the older grave markers. In the area toward the center of the main clearing, the meters registered elevations above baseline that the investigators documented with location coordinates, timestamps, and descriptions of what else was or was not present in the immediate environment at the moment of each reading. Near the path toward the lagoon, a similar pattern emerged, localized, variable, settling back to baseline between the zones where it spiked. Skeptical investigators examining the Ghost Research Society's EMF documentation have proposed several mundane mechanisms that could account for localized electromagnetic anomalies in a cemetery setting. Old grave markers, particularly those made of granite or iron-rich stone, carry residual magnetic signatures that can produce modest EM readings independent of any external power source. Geological variation beneath the soil surface, different mineral concentrations, buried iron deposits, variations in subsoil moisture can produce EM fields that a sensitive meter will detect without the presence of any supernatural cause. The specific topography of the Bachelor's Grove location, with its low-lying terrain, adjacent water, and complex of tree root systems beneath the surface, offers more potential sources of EM variation than a flat, open, electrically simple environment would provide. The skeptical investigator's position is that the readings the Ghost Research Society documented do not require a supernatural explanation, that the mundane candidates are sufficient. The Ghost Research Society's researchers, reviewing the same data, found the clustering of the elevated readings in the specific zones they documented, near the oldest markers and toward the water, suggestive of something more particular than geological variation would straightforwardly produce. Neither position has, in the decades since the investigation, been demonstrated to be clearly correct. The investigation continued across multiple sessions that summer, the team working through the cemetery on evenings and overnight, building the detailed field log that Cosmorec's published report would draw from. The approach was systematic in a way that distinguished it from the informal ghost hunting that had characterized most visitor activity at Bachelor's Grove in the preceding decades. Planned observation periods, designated zones for instrument deployment, documented conditions including temperature, humidity, and ambient light level for each session. This methodology did not produce certainty. What it produced was a more carefully constructed uncertainty, a documentation of what the instruments recorded and what the investigators observed, organized with enough rigor that subsequent researchers could engage with the data, rather than simply receiving an assertion that strange things had happened at the site. What the published report documents, taken as a whole, is a location that consistently produces anomalous readings and observations across multiple detection methods: photographic, electromagnetic, and direct witness report, in a pattern that is not random in its distribution across the grounds, but clustered in specific zones, particularly near the oldest surviving markers and the path toward the lagoon. The report does not advance a paranormal explanation for these findings. It documents the findings and notes that the conventional explanations that have been offered for them are, in the investigator's assessment, not fully adequate. The report exists as a formal document in the Ghost Research Society's records, dated 1991, still referenced in subsequent research on the location. Its conclusions are the same today as when they were written. The case is not closed. The photographic anomalies documented at Bachelor's Grove across the full period of investigation interest in the site extend well beyond the single image Huff produced in 1991, though that photograph remains the most studied. The accumulated body of photographic material includes orbs, small luminous circles appearing in photographs taken at the site, concentrated more heavily in the areas near the older markers, and streaking light trails, elongated luminous shapes crossing the frame in exposures that should not produce motion blur given the conditions under which they were taken. Concentrated luminous mists appear in a subset of the photographs, not diffuse across the frame, but localized, columns of brighter density, roughly the width of a human form, positioned between specific markers, their edges crisper than moisture on a lens would typically produce. Skeptical analysts have worked through the Bachelor's Grove photograph collection with care. Orbs, in the majority of documented cases across paranormal photography generally, are attributable to out-of-focus particulate matter, dust, pollen, moisture droplets, caught in the near field of the camera's flash and rendered as luminous circles by the optics of the lens. Streaking light trails frequently result from long exposures in low light, insect movement caught in flash at close range, or camera movement during the exposure. Luminous mists can be produced by breath condensation, lens moisture, and the way certain atmospheric conditions scatter light sources outside the frame. These explanations account for a large proportion of the photographic anomalies collected at Bachelor's Grove and at paranormal investigation sites generally. Researchers on both sides of the inquiry agree that the majority of the photographic material from Bachelor's Grove is explainable in conventional terms. Where the debate persists is in the subset of images, Huff's 1991 photograph among them, that the standard explanations have not fully accounted for, where the proposed mechanism and the observed artifact do not quite match up in a way that allows the question to be put down cleanly. A Bachelor's Grove photograph that falls into that subset shows a luminous formation between two grave markers in the northeast portion of the main clearing. The formation is roughly columnar, wider at the center than at the edges, extending vertically from a point low to the ground to a height consistent with a standing human form. The edges of the formation are not feathered, the way lens moisture or breath condensation typically appears in a photograph. They maintain a relative definition that researchers who have examined the image note as unusual for an environmental atmospheric artifact. The photograph was taken in conditions documented at the time, a dry evening, ambient temperature in the mid-50s, no precipitation in the preceding 24 hours. The investigator who took it did not report seeing anything visible to the naked eye between the two markers at the moment of the exposure. What the camera recorded and what the investigator saw at that moment were not the same thing. The discrepancy has not been explained to a level that satisfies the researchers who have examined both the image and the documentation around it. The cemetery, on a full moon night, understood not as a stage for phenomena, but as a physical location, has its own particular character that the investigation reports describe with some consistency. The white limestone of the surviving markers does catch the moonlight. The open paths do run between them for short distances before narrowing. The tree line does form a dark and almost solid-looking wall. At the perimeter, the canopy closing above into a low ceiling through which moonlight enters in broken pieces. Standing still in the clearing for an extended period allows the eyes to adjust in stages, first to the distinction between the path surface and the surrounding ground cover, then to the specific placement of the visible markers. Then, if the light is sufficient, to the darker areas near the older stones where the ground has been disturbed more often by successive decades of visitation. The reports that investigators have produced across multiple sessions consistently note the stillness of the site on calm nights as something qualitatively distinct from the quiet of other locations, a density to the absence of sound that some investigators have attempted to characterize and have ultimately simply noted as a consistent observational feature without advancing an explanation for it. The hooded figure near the lagoon, the large 19th century man, the glowing doubled shape in the wooded perimeter, Each of these accounts comes from a different era of the site's documented investigative history, and each was produced by a witness or witnesses who had at minimum heard the general reputation of the location before visiting it. This is the central methodological difficulty in evaluating the witness testimony from Bachelor's Grove. The site's reputation has been established long enough and spread widely enough through paranormal literature and local oral tradition that very few of the witnesses reporting experiences there can be placed in the category of visitors who had no prior knowledge of what others had reported. The exceptions, witnesses who reported their experiences before the broader reputation of the site had become widely accessible, or who documented their observations before learning what others had seen, are treated by researchers as the more evidentially significant part of the account pool. The reports most likely to be genuinely independent of the legend rather than shaped by it. Those earlier, cleaner accounts describe figures similar to those in the later accounts. The similarity is either evidence that the accounts are independently converging on something genuinely present at the site, or evidence that the legend was already established enough, even in its earlier form, to shape perception. The researchers have not resolved which interpretation better fits the data. The Ghost Research Society's 1991 investigation took place at what was already, by that point, a well-known site in the regional paranormal literature. Kazmarek and his team were not arriving at a blank location. They had files, prior accounts, a documented history of reports to work from. What the systematic investigation added to the record was not new phenomena, but a different quality of documentation for phenomena that had already been reported. The infrared photograph with its seated figure, the EMF readings with their specific clustering, the organized log of observations that allowed the 1991 data to be compared with what had been noted in less formal accounts over the preceding decades. The pattern the systematic investigation found was consistent with the pattern in the prior accounts. The instruments and the stories, placed side by side, pointed at the same areas of the grounds. That consistency is part of what researchers have continued to find worth examining in the Ghost Research Society's published report. The instruments moved through the cemetery that August evening toward the lagoon path, the EMF needle holding near baseline for the first portion of the route, and then, at a point the investigators marked on their site map, rising into elevated territory, a localized spike above ambient that persisted for a short distance along the path before settling back. No conventional EM source was identified at that location. The investigators noted the reading, its duration, its coordinates relative to the marked site plan, and moved on. The reading is one data point in a larger set. Taken alone, it explains nothing. Set within the pattern, the investigation documented across multiple sessions and multiple instruments, it becomes part of what the published report calls, carefully, without assertion, a consistent localization of anomalous readings at specific points within the cemetery grounds, independent of any identifiable conventional electromagnetic source. The White Lady has been seen, in the accounts that document her, on full moon nights when the limestone is bright and the air is clear enough to read distance reasonably well. The seated figure in Huff's photograph appeared in August in the warmth of a summer investigation and appeared not to anyone present but to the developed print afterward, a presence that the film registered and no human eye captured at the moment of exposure. These two kinds of account, the direct witness report and the photographic anomaly, are different in their nature and in what can be done with them analytically. The direct witness report depends on the accuracy and reliability of human perception and memory, both of which are subject to well-documented limitations. The photographic anomaly, by contrast, is fixed. The image exists. It does not change when remembered, It can be examined repeatedly by researchers who were not present. What it cannot do is explain itself. It sits in the record with the same unresolved quality it has held since the print was first developed, and the figure on the stone became visible in the developer tray. That image, a translucent figure seated on a grave marker in an infrared black and white print, taken in August of 1991, developed and examined and distributed to researchers and never satisfactorily explained in the decades since, is still in circulation. Researchers who have encountered it for the first time in recent years report in the literature the same experience that those who encountered it closer to its original development described: the sense of examining something whose explanation should be straightforward, and finding that none of the straightforward explanations quite account for what the image actually shows. The figure does not resolve, the stone shows through her, the image is clear, and the question it contains is not. The Ghost Research Society's published report from the 1991 investigation runs to multiple pages of field notes, instrument readings, photographic documentation, and witness accounts compiled across the summer survey. It was written with the methodical care that characterizes formal investigative documentation, specific, qualified, careful not to assert more than the data supports. It sits in the organization's records. It has been referenced in subsequent academic and independent research on the Bachelor's Grove site, and on the broader study of electromagnetic anomalies in locations associated with high densities of paranormal witness reports. The EMF readings are in it, the photograph is in it. The accounts of the White Lady and the other figures, gathered and compared against the prior record, are in it. The report does not conclude that Bachelor's Grove is haunted. It concludes that the location produces anomalous readings and observations in a pattern that the investigation was unable to account for through conventional means, and that further study is warranted. The file, as it was written and as it stands now, is open. The cemetery continues to exist at the end of the quarter-mile path from the Midlothian Turnpike, inside the Rubio Woods Forest Preserve, the surviving grave markers holding their positions in the softening ground, the tree line at the perimeter dark and close, the lagoon a short distance away along the path that runs downward through the lower terrain. The photograph Huff took is still a photograph. The figure on the stone is still there, in every print, on every screen where the image has appeared in the years since 1991. The investigation that produced it is still the most rigorously documented, formal inquiry into the Bachelor's Grove phenomena that exists in the published record. Its findings have not been overturned. They have not been confirmed. They have simply continued to sit in the file, legible and unresolved, the way a question written down carefully in a field log remains legible long after the investigator who wrote it has put the pen down and gone home. The cemetery quiet behind them, the night continuing without needing to explain itself to anyone still awake inside it. The lagoon at Bachelor's Grove sits low in the forest, gathered in a shallow depression where the land fails to drain properly and the water simply stays. In winter it is gray, in summer it greens over at the margins. In the accounts left by Cook County Forest Preserve staff, who worked the area across the latter half of the 20th century, it appears not as a scenic feature, but as a practical fact of the grounds, a body of standing water close to the cemetery boundary, the source of ground fog that forms on cool nights and drifts toward the path, a place where the land is soft enough at the edges to shift underfoot, and where the water's depth is difficult to read from the bank. The lagoon is not large. A person standing at its near edge can see the far shore without difficulty, but the accounts associated with it, the historical ones, the ones preserved in local records and oral tradition across more than a century, give it a weight that its physical dimensions do not entirely account for. What the lagoon is said to have held across different periods and for different reasons is the part of Bachelor's Grove's history that sits underneath the cemetery's documented chronology of pioneer families and abandoned grave markers, the part that did not make it into the genealogical records, the part that arrived at the lagoon quietly, in the dark, and did not leave. Some of what has been said about the Bachelor's Grove Lagoon belongs to oral tradition more than to forensic documentation. It is worth holding those two categories carefully apart, because the difference between them matters between what local historical accounts have consistently reported and what the public evidentiary record has actually confirmed. The Prohibition-era accounts fall into the first category. They have been reported across multiple sources, described by researchers of the site, and treated as a plausible element of the area's history, given what is documented about organized crime networks in the southern Chicago suburbs during the 1920s and early 1930s. What they have not been, as of the available public record, is forensically confirmed. The Chicago outfit's reach into Cook County's southern suburbs during the Prohibition period is itself documented. The networks were real. The violence associated with them was real. The general practice of body disposal in remote waterways and forested areas outside the city limits is documented in connection with outfit-related killings from that era. What researchers of Bachelor's Grove have noted is that the lagoon, low-lying, wooded, remote enough in the pre-automobile era to require deliberate effort to reach, and positioned off a road that connected the southern suburbs to the city's outskirts, fits the geographic profile of a location that networks operating in that area might have used. The historical accounts say that it was. No confirmed forensic recovery of outfit-related remains from the lagoon has been placed in the public record, and the claim rests on the circumstantial plausibility of local tradition rather than on documented evidence. It is noted here because it has been reported consistently and because it is part of what researchers have had to consider when trying to understand the cumulative weight of what has been associated with this particular stretch of water and the grounds beside it. The lagoon has a second account attached to it, older than the Prohibition stories, belonging to the 19th century and to the working landscape that surrounded the cemetery during its active years. A farmer and his horse, the account holds, were lost in the lagoon during a farming accident. The details that have survived across multiple retellings involve plow equipment, a team of animals, and ground at the water's edge that gave way. Man and horse were pulled under by the weight of what they were attached to, the account says, and neither came back up. The story has been reported consistently enough and across sources distant enough from each other that researchers of the site have generally treated it as a probable reference to a real event, a farming accident at the lagoon margin, whose precise details have been altered through the long movement of oral transmission, but whose core fact, a man and an animal drowned in this water, may be grounded in something that actually happened. The south bank of the lagoon, at the spot most often associated with the account, drops away from a low bank into water whose depth cannot be read from standing height. The ground is soft enough, in spring and after sustained rain, that footing is unreliable there. The physical conditions for such an accident exist. What has been reported at that section of shoreline, across various accounts from visitors to the cemetery over many decades, is something separate from the historical record and harder to place. The farmer and the horse are among the figures that witnesses have described encountering at Bachelor's Grove, specifically near the lagoon edge, specifically at the location where the bank drops away. These accounts are part of the wider body of reported phenomena at the site and are held here the same way those accounts are generally held, as reported, documented across multiple sources, and not established as anything beyond what witnesses described having experienced. The relevant point in the context of the lagoon's history is that the water and its margin have accumulated accounts across different periods and different kinds of event, some belonging to the working 19th century, some to the criminal 20th, and that this accumulation is part of what makes the lagoon an anchor point in the site's history, rather than simply a geographic feature. The damage done to Bachelor's Grove Cemetery during the 1970s and 1980s is documented in Cook County law enforcement records and Forest Preserve incident reports, and it was extensive enough to leave the cemetery in a condition that has never been fully repaired. The grave markers were the primary target. Stones were overturned, stones were broken, stones were pushed face down into the leaf litter, their carved surfaces pressed into the earth, the names they carried rendered invisible without physically lifting the stone free. A Forest Preserve staff member doing a routine check of the grounds in that period might walk the cemetery's modest length and find more markers horizontal than vertical, some of them broken at the base where they had been forced over, some of them shattered, the pale limestone edges where they had fractured still bright and unweathered. The damage new enough that it had not yet been softened by rain and moss. The people named on those stones had been buried there in the 1840s, and 1850s, and 1860s. They were members of the founding families, the Fultons, the Ritters, and others whose surnames had been carved into the limestone by whoever did the work of marking the dead in rural Cook County during those decades. The markers had been standing for 100 years when the vandalism began. They had survived the abandonment of the cemetery by the founding families, the encroachment of the forest, the decades of unmaintained ground. What they did not survive, or did not all survive, was sustained deliberate force applied by people who came to the cemetery in the dark with no traceable purpose beyond destruction. The Cook County law enforcement records from this period document arrests related to trespassing and destruction of property at Bachelor's Grove, which establishes that the damage was noted, that some portion of it was witnessed or evidenced in time for prosecution, and that the cemetery's condition was known to county authorities well before the most severe vandalism had reached its peak. Knowing about a problem and being able to stop it are not the same thing. The cemetery sat at the end of a quarter-mile path through Forest Preserve land. It was not visible from the road. The path itself was not illuminated. A group of people who chose to enter the grounds after dark and work quietly had time to do a great deal before anyone arrived to respond, and the record suggests that this is largely what happened, that the damage accumulated over years rather than in a single event, in that by the time the worst of it had been done, the question was not how to prevent it, but how much of what had already been destroyed could be recovered. The answer to that question was not encouraging. Many of the grave markers at Bachelor's Grove were not just damaged but removed entirely. Headstones, some of them carrying inscriptions from the 1860s, some from earlier decades of the 19th century, were taken from the cemetery by trespassers and transported to locations that had nothing to do with the site. The distances involved varied. Some recovered stones were found at Forest Preserve parking lots relatively near the cemetery. Others turned up at private residences. Some were found at other cemeteries, carried there by people whose motivation for doing so has never been satisfactorily explained. Cook County authorities have in documented cases attempted the repatriation of recovered markers to the cemetery, a process of locating a stone, establishing its origin from the inscriptions it carries, transporting it back to the site, and placing it among the surviving markers where it belongs. Yet some recovered stones have gone back. Many have not been located. The full accounting of what was removed from Bachelor's Grove during this period has never been completed, and the cemetery that exists now reflects that incompleteness, a collection of markers, some original, some returned, some still missing. One recovered marker, found some distance from the cemetery, weathered and mossy from its time outside the forest preserve grounds, still carrying a legible name and a date from the 1860s, was returned to the site by a county official and placed back among the stones where it had stood originally. The name on it belongs to someone buried at Bachelor's Grove in the years when the cemetery was still an active burial ground, when the founding families were still coming to the site to bury their dead, when the cleared plot at the edge of the farmland was a maintained and purposeful place. The stone had traveled a long way from where it was meant to remain. Being placed back among the other markers was not the same as being restored to its original position. Too much had changed, too many markers had moved or been lost for precise placement to be possible. But the name was legible, the date was legible. Whatever had been done to the stone during the years it was absent from the cemetery had not erased what was cut into it. And that fact, that the inscription persisted through everything the stone had been subjected to, is the kind of detail that sits quietly in the record without requiring emphasis. The period of most severe vandalism at Bachelor's Grove overlapped with a period in which the cemetery was also the site of a different kind of activity, one that left different evidence and is documented in a different category of incident report. Forest Preserve staff, law enforcement officers, and investigators examining the grounds across the 1970s, 80s, and into the 1990s found evidence of occult ritual activity within the cemetery on multiple documented occasions. The evidence varied by incident. In some cases, it was candles, arrangements of spent candles on cleared patches of earth near older markers, the wax pooled and hardened on the ground, the arrangement deliberate enough in its geometry to distinguish from the kind of random debris that accumulates in any outdoor space frequented by trespassers. In other cases, it was drawn symbols on grave markers, applied in paint or chalk or other materials to the stone surfaces, symbols that Forest Preserve staff documented by photograph before removing them. In some incidents, the evidence was more disturbing. Animal carcasses positioned in ways consistent with deliberate ritualistic placement rather than natural death. The arrangement of the remains having a quality of intentionality that distinguished it from what a predator or scavenger would produce. The incident reports from these discoveries are part of the Cook County Forest Preserve's administrative record. They note what was found, where it was found within the cemetery grounds, and what was done with it, typically photographed for documentation, then removed and disposed of. The reports do not speculate on the affiliation or identity of the individuals responsible, and the available public record does not contain extensive information about who was conducting these activities or under what organized structure, if any. What the reports establish is that the activity was recurring, not a single isolated incident, but a pattern that continued across decades and required repeated responses from staff and law enforcement. The cemetery's location at the end of an unlit forest path, not visible from the road, made it a space that people who wanted privacy for activities they would not conduct in visible public places had reason to use, and the record suggests that different groups or individuals made use of it for this purpose across a long span of years. The combination of things that happened at Bachelor's Grove Cemetery across the second half of the 20th century, the The vandalism, the theft of grave markers, the ritual activity left the grounds in a condition that is neither the original cemetery nor entirely a natural space. It is something in between. The stones that remain are a partial record of who was buried there. The stones that are gone are an absence in that record. The damage that was done and not repaired, the broken markers, the disturbed ground, the traces of what the site was used for during its years of abandonment, is still visible to anyone who walks the grounds carefully enough to look for it. The history of what happened here is not hidden. It simply did not make it into the same kind of documentation as the founding families and the pioneer burial records. It persists in a different register of the archive. The lagoon sits at the edge of all of this, unchanged by any of it. Water does not record what happens at its margins in any recoverable way. The gray surface in winter, the green margins in summer, the ground fog rising on cool nights and drifting toward the path, none of that changes in response to the human history that has accumulated on the banks. The lagoon is as wide as it has always been. The water is as deep as it has always been. Whatever the Prohibition era accounts say was placed in it, whatever the 19th century accident account says was lost in it, the surface gives nothing away and has not at any point in the documented history of the site. What Cook County records do hold for the lagoon's surroundings is a sequence of incident reports and law enforcement contacts that establishes a pattern of activity around the cemetery across several decades. The records are administrative documents, terse, specific, written in the language of institutional documentation rather than narrative. A date, a location within the preserve, what was observed or found, what action was taken. They do not build to a conclusion, they accumulate. Each entry is its own contained notation. Across the span of the record, they describe a place that was repeatedly entered without authorization, repeatedly damaged, and repeatedly returned to by people whose purposes ranged from careless to deliberate, and whose presence left traces that required response and documentation. The pattern in the record is what makes the record significant, not any single entry, but the length and consistency of the sequence. The ritual activity at Bachelor's Grove has been noted by paranormal researchers as potentially relevant to the site's reported phenomena, in the sense that some investigators have speculated about whether sustained ceremonial use of a location affects what that location subsequently produces in terms of anomalous reports. This is not a position that has been established or examined in any scientific framework that would allow a conclusion to be drawn from it, and it is mentioned here only because it appears in the research literature associated with the site and is part of the context that investigators have worked within. The relationship between the human history of Bachelor's Grove, the vandalism, the ritual use, the decades of activity in the dark, and the reported phenomena that make the cemetery notable in the paranormal literature has not been established. Researchers have noted the overlap. They have not resolved what, if anything, it means. There is a particular quality to a place that has been used against its own purpose. A cemetery is, in its design and function, a place of maintained record, the names cut into stone, the dates fixed, the boundary between the ground of the dead and the rest of the landscape made clear and respected. Bachelor's Grove was that. During the decades when the founding families maintained it and buried their dead within its boundaries, the community that sustained it dispersed. The families aged out. The land returned slowly to forest. And then, during the years when no one was maintaining the site, and the forest preserve designation offered protection in theory but not consistently in practice, the cemetery became a place where the opposite of maintenance happened, where records were obscured, boundaries were ignored, and the ground was used for purposes that had nothing to do with the people buried in it. The grave markers that survived are the ones the vandalism did not reach, or reached and did not destroy. The markers that were returned are the ones someone happened to find and establish a provenance for. What makes the cemetery legible as a historical site? The surviving stones, the legible names, the dates that connect the burial ground to the pioneer families who established it, is what remains after a sustained process of erasure. That the inscriptions on many of the recovered stones are still legible, despite everything they were subjected to, is a fact worth noting precisely. Limestone is not particularly durable. A century and a half of weather and soil contact would wear any inscription toward illegibility under ordinary conditions. The stones that came back from wherever they had been taken, mossy and weathered, carrying names cut in the 1860s, those names persisted because the carving went deep enough into the stone that surface weathering alone could not obliterate them. The people who cut those inscriptions were not cutting them for the duration of a generation. They were cutting for something longer than that. The shoreline of the lagoon that is associated with the 19th century drowning account drops off quickly from a low bank into water whose depth cannot be confirmed from standing height. In any season when the ground is soft, spring thaw, prolonged autumn rain, the particular instability of freeze-thaw cycling in the low-lying terrain of the Rubio Woods Forest Preserve, the bank at that location offers unreliable footing. A team of horses pulling a plow, moving along the edge of a field boundary in the kind of spring conditions when such work would be done, coming to ground that appeared firm and finding it otherwise. The mechanics of such an accident are not difficult to reconstruct. The weight of the equipment, the momentum of the animals, the soft ground giving way without warning. In the account that has been told about this location across different sources and different decades of retelling describes exactly the kind of accident that the physical conditions at that shoreline would permit. Whether the account describes a specific real event or has condensed several incidents or drifted toward this location from somewhere else entirely is not something the record can settle. What the record holds is the consistency of the account across retellings and the physical conditions at the site that make it credible as a location where such a thing could have happened. The criminal history of Bachelor's Grove and the civil damage done to it exist in a different category from the phenomena that researchers and investigators have documented at the site. They are human history, documented, traceable to specific periods and specific types of activity, subject to the same kind of evidentiary analysis as any other historical record. The reported phenomena, the apparitions, the photographic anomalies, the retreating structure that witnesses have described seeing in the wooded margin belong to a different part of the record, held in a different framework, examined by a different set of methodologies. These two bodies of material share a location. Whether they share anything beyond that has not been established. What has been established across the available Cook County administrative and law enforcement record is that Bachelor's Grove Cemetery was the site of sustained criminal activity for several decades, that this activity caused damage to the burial ground that has been partially but not fully remediated, and that the cemetery that exists now is a partial and imperfect version of what was originally established by the founding families in the 1840s. The stones that remain are real. The names on them are real. The dates are real. The damage done to the site and not repaired is real. All of this is in the record, available to anyone who looks. What the lagoon held during the Prohibition years, if it held anything beyond the water and the silt and the seasonal variation in depth that any low-lying body of water accumulates across a century, is not in the record in any confirmed form. The tradition says one thing: the forensic documentation is silent. Between those two positions is a space that the available evidence cannot close, and the record does not close it. It remains as a notation in the history of the site, reported across multiple sources, given circumstantial plausibility by the documented geography of outfit activity in the southern suburbs, not confirmed by any forensic recovery that has been placed in the public record. The lagoon does not comment on this. It sits where it has always sat, gathered in its shallow depression in the forest, its surface reflecting the sky, the fog rising from it on cool nights and moving toward the path in the direction of the cemetery boundary and the grave markers beyond. The grave marker that was returned to Bachelor's Grove, mossy, aged, the name on it belonging to someone buried in the 1860s, the stone having been found at some distance from where it was meant to stand, was placed back among the surviving stones by a county official performing an act of administrative repatriation. It was not a ceremony. It was not a restoration. It was a practical action taken within the limits of what was recoverable, a stone identified, a provenance established from the inscription it carried, a transport arranged, a placement made. The stone is among the others now. The name it carries is still legible. Whatever the stone was subjected to during its years away from the cemetery did not erase what was cut into it in the 1860s, and that, the persistence of the inscription, the name still holding its shape in the limestone after everything, is the fact the record ends on, as simple and as plain as the original carving itself. A researcher unfolds a Cook County plat map across the surface of an archive table, the paper giving a soft sound as it opens, the edges still holding the memory of their long fold. The map is old enough that its ink has shifted from black toward brown in places, and the property lines it records, the precise rectangular parcels of farmland laid out by General Land Office surveyors in the middle decades of the 19th century, are drawn in a hand that moved with confidence across the page, marking boundaries that seemed, at the time of their drawing, perfectly permanent. The researcher's pencil moves along one of those lines now, tracing the eastern boundary of a parcel adjacent to the cemetery grounds, looking for something specific. The question is simple enough to state. A farmhouse-sized building has been reported, consistently and across several decades, at a particular location along the wooded margin just beyond the Bachelor's Grove Cemetery entrance. The plat maps are the closest thing to a definitive answer available in the archive. And the archive on this point is not yet done being read. The Cook County Records Office holds a considerable body of 19th century land survey material for the Bremen Township area, General Land Office plats, township atlases from the 1860s and 1870s, assessors' maps that show structures as small rectangles on the recorded parcels, each one representing a building that existed at the time the map was drawn and was considered real enough to tax. Researchers have gone through these materials looking for the farmhouse. The search is not unreasonable. Agricultural settlement in the Bachelor's Grove area was active from the 1830s onward, and farmhouses were built, occupied, and when the farming families dispersed, abandoned, and eventually demolished, or left to collapse across the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th. It is entirely possible that a structure once stood near the cemetery boundary. The records, examined carefully, confirm that agricultural parcels in the area were developed with farmhouses and outbuildings during the relevant period. What they have not yet provided is a definitive footprint, a building of the right size in the right location at the coordinates where the sightings have been concentrated. The answer the researcher is looking for may be on the next page. It may be in a record not yet retrieved. It may be in a document that was not preserved. The atmosphere of an archive at this kind of work is its own particular thing. The paper has a smell that is part dust and part time, the specific density of old rooms where documents have been kept dry for 100 years, the slight resistance of aged pages that have been folded and refolded and have learned the shape of their own creases. The work moves slowly, which is appropriate to what it is looking for. The farmhouse, if a farmhouse there was, in the physical sense, at the location in question, would have been built sometime after the mid-19th century surveys were completed, and before the date of the earliest reported sightings. That narrows the window, but does not close it. The plat maps are consulted. The township atlases are opened and examined, page by page. The assessor's records are cross-referenced, and the researcher's pencil continues its slow movement along the boundary lines, looking for a rectangle of the right dimensions in the right location, a small mark on an old page that would mean something specific about a white house with a porch and warm light in the downstairs window. The earliest sightings of the farmhouse at Bachelor's Grove are not easily dated with precision. The phenomenon appears in the documented record most clearly from the mid-20th century onward, with Chicago area paranormal researcher Richard Crow among those who assembled multiple eyewitness testimonies over decades of fieldwork in the greater Chicago area. What Crow's accounts show, taken together, is not a wild or inconsistent body of reports. The physical description that witnesses offer is notably stable across different people, different times, different lighting conditions at the site. A white two-story wood-frame structure, a front porch with wooden railings, a pitched roof, shuttered windows, and in the downstairs window, visible from a distance of perhaps 200 yards, warm light, the kind of light that suggests interior occupation, a lamp or a fire, something burning inside a house where someone is home. From that distance, the structure looks entirely ordinary. It looks like a farmhouse that has stood at the edge of the woods for a long time and intends to go on standing there. It is only when a witness begins to move toward it that the ordinary quality of the thing becomes complicated. The retreat is the defining feature. Every documented account of the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse includes the same behavioral detail. As the witness moves toward the structure does not remain at a fixed location. It maintains its distance. It retreats at exactly the pace the observer advances, so that the gap between the witness and the house stays constant regardless of how far the witness walks. The structure does not vanish suddenly. It does not flicker or distort. It simply remains in apparent solidity at the same remove, 200 yards away, then 200 yards away, then 200 yards away again, until the witness eventually stops walking and stands in the field or on the path and watches the house sit quietly in the middle distance, looking entirely real, entirely there, entirely unreachable. No documented account has recorded a witness who successfully closed that distance. No account describes anyone touching the porch railing, stepping onto the front steps, looking through the lit window from close range. The house has never been entered in the record by anyone who went looking for it. A thermal imaging camera trained on the open field margin at the Bachelor's Grove Cemetery entrance on an autumn evening shows something specific and clear, and for the purposes of the question being asked, not entirely conclusive. The camera records heat differentials with considerable precision. The tree line registers as one temperature gradient. The open air between the trees and the path registers as another cooler zone. The ground holds its own reading, distinct from both. The screen is a detailed and accurate map of what is thermally present in the field of view, and what the screen does not show in any publicly available footage from any of the investigations that have brought this equipment to the site, is a structure matching the reported farmhouse description at the location where sightings are concentrated. No walls, no roofline, no porch. The thermal map of the site, on the evenings it has been taken, shows an empty field margin and a tree line in the lagoon's warmer water surface, producing its characteristic heat signature above the cooler woodland air. The camera is accurate. The absence of a structure in the thermal record is real, and the question of what witnesses have been seeing when they report the farmhouse, what produces the image of a white two-story building with a porch and warm interior light, remains where it was before the camera was pointed at the field. Atmospheric refraction has been proposed as one framework for the visual phenomenon. The Bachelor's Grove Lagoon, sitting adjacent to the cemetery at low elevation within the forest preserve, is reliably warmer than the surrounding woodland air during the transitional seasons, late spring and early autumn particularly, when the water retains daytime heat that the canopy-shaded ground does not. The temperature differential between the warmer water surface and the cooler air above the wooded terrain creates conditions where light traveling through the air can be bent at the boundary layer, refracted, in the way that a straight stick appears to bend at the waterline when it is pushed into a still pond. Under the right conditions, a light source beyond the tree line, a house, a road, a lit window on a distant farm, could be optically transported and repositioned by the refraction, appearing to a viewer at a particular angle as a structure in a location where no structure stands. The conditions most frequently reported for farmhouse sightings match the conditions most favorable to this kind of atmospheric effect: dusk, dawn, overcast daylight hours, and foggy mornings along the Midlothian Turnpike corridor, when the moisture from the lagoon drifts across the path and diffuses whatever light remains. The refraction hypothesis accounts for some things. It accounts for the low light and high moisture conditions of the sightings. It accounts for why the structure would appear at a consistent remove rather than at variable distances. A refracted image maintains the geometry of its light path. The apparent position shifts with the viewer's position, but the relationship between viewer and image stays geometrically constant, which would produce precisely the retreating quality that witnesses describe. What the hypothesis accounts for less cleanly is the consistency of the physical description across accounts separated by decades. A refracted image produced by different light sources on different evenings over 50 years would not be expected to show the same white two-story structure with the same front porch and the same warm light in the same downstairs window. Atmospheric refraction is a real phenomenon. Its applicability to this specific body of accounts is a genuine question, not a settled one. Ground fog forming above the Bachelor's Grove Lagoon on a cool October evening does something specific to the surrounding visual landscape. The moisture rises from the warmer water surface and drifts on the lightest air movement toward the open field margin at the cemetery's edge, not a heavy fog, in most accounts, but a low-lying layer that sits at knee height or just above, softening the boundary between the ground and the air and reducing the contrast that allows the eye to read distances accurately. In this kind of light, at this kind of hour, the tree line at the far edge of the clearing loses the precision of its individual shapes. The oaks and hickories that are clearly distinct from one another in afternoon light become in fog and dusk a continuous wall of indeterminate depth. The open space between the path and the tray line takes on a flat gray-green quality that makes it difficult to determine whether the field is 20 yards deep or 200. The light scatters off the moisture in the air, and the scatter reaches the eye from directions that don't correspond to any particular source, and the visual system, accustomed to interpreting scattered light as a surface, begins to propose surfaces where there are none. Pareidolia, as an explanatory framework, covers part of this territory. The human visual system is disposed toward finding structured forms in ambiguous visual data, shapes in cloud cover, faces in shadow patterns, windows and walls in the play of light through moving vegetation. The same disposition that allows the visual system to extract a face from a partly occluded figure in low light also causes it to propose faces in contexts where no face is actually present, assembling the available fragments into a coherent structure that the mind then holds as perceived rather than inferred. Applied to the farmhouse, the Pareidolia framework suggests that the white structure with its porch and railings and warm window light is assembled by visual systems doing what they are built to do, finding structure in an ambiguous field of pale light, ground fog, and dark vegetation, and reporting back what they have found as something that looks entirely like a house. This is not a dismissive explanation. It describes a real perceptual mechanism operating in exactly the conditions the sightings describe. Whether it fully accounts for the consistency of the reports, the same specific description, the same specific behavior across witnesses who had no known prior contact with each other, is the part that researchers have not settled. 2 witness reports of the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse, laid side by side on a research table, do something specific to the question of cultural transmission versus independent observation. One report is from the 1960s, one is from the 1980s. The people who made them have no documented connection to each other, different names, different addresses, different circumstances of visit. Both describe a white 2-story structure with a porch and warm interior light. Both describe the structure retreating as they move toward it. The physical specificity of the description is consistent between them, not just the general shape of a house, but particular details, the railings, the pitch of the roof, the quality of the light in the window, the fact that the house looks, from a distance, like a house that someone currently lives in. Researchers who have examined the full body of eyewitness testimony have noted this cross-temporal consistency as one of the features that distinguishes the farmhouse account pool from more variable paranormal witness literature, a phenomenon described in exactly the same terms by witnesses who reported before any significant public documentation of the sightings existed, carries within the analytical frameworks researchers apply to this material more evidential weight than accounts made after the legend had circulated widely. The distinction between witnesses who reported their experience before exposure to the legend and those who reported after is one that investigators specifically address when evaluating the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse accounts. A witness who visits Bachelor's Grove having read about the phantom farmhouse, expecting to see it, and then sees a white structure in the wooded margin carries different evidential value than a witness who had no prior knowledge of the reports and experienced the sighting without expectation. Researchers treating the former group as more evidentially significant than the latter is a methodological distinction grounded in ordinary witness reliability analysis, the kind applied in legal and psychological contexts, as well as investigative ones. The Bachelor's Grove farmhouse account pool contains both types: the pre-legend witnesses, those who appear to have had no prior knowledge of the phenomenon when they reported it, represent the smaller and more evidentially interesting subset. Their accounts are the ones that the refraction and periodolia frameworks most need to address, and the ones those frameworks address least cleanly. A researcher reviewing the published Ghost Research Society investigation report from August 1991 is reading a document that has aged without being resolved. Dale Kaczmarek led the investigation. The team moved through the Bachelor's Grove grounds on an August night with the equipment available to investigators of that period: handheld electromagnetic field meters, cameras loaded with various film stocks, including infrared, and the careful documentation practices that characterize the organization's field methodology. The EMF readings they recorded in specific zones of the cemetery, particularly near older grave markers and along the path toward the lagoon, elevated above ambient baseline in locations where no conventional electrical infrastructure was present to account for the readings. Those elevations were documented, reported, and subsequently cited in further research. They have not been explained away, and they have not been explained. The candidate explanations for localized EMF anomalies in the Bachelor's Grove grounds are several, and none of them is without basis. Geological variation in the subsurface material beneath the cemetery, variations in iron content, magnetic mineral density, or the conductivity of the saturated low-lying soil could produce localized magnetic signatures detectable by sensitive field instruments. The metallic content of old iron grave markers, cast iron fencing fragments, and buried hardware associated with 19th century coffin construction could contribute to elevated readings in zones where those materials are concentrated. Residual soil magnetic signatures, the gradual remanent magnetism that ferrous materials in soil acquire over time, are a documented phenomenon in geological fieldwork, and the Bachelor's Grove grounds, saturated with decades of organic and inorganic material, would not be an unreasonable location for such signatures to appear. Skeptical investigators have proposed all of these explanations. What they have not done is produce a specific ground survey of the Bachelor's Grove Cemetery that maps the subsurface geology precisely enough to attribute each recorded EMF anomaly to a specific geological or material cause. The readings have been documented, the conventional explanations have been proposed. The match between the proposed causes and the specific readings has not been demonstrated in sufficient detail to close the question. The path from the Midlothian Turnpike entrance to the lagoon edge, walked at night with an EMF meter in hand, produces a specific experience for the researcher walking it. For the first 100 yards or so, as the path moves through second-growth woodland, and the sound of passing traffic on the turnpike fades behind the first few rows of trees, the meter reads at or near baseline. The ambient electromagnetic environment of the forest at that hour is what it would be expected to be, low and consistent, the background radiation of the natural world at some distance from any power infrastructure. Then, approaching the waterline, the reading changes. Not dramatically, not the sweep of a needle to the far end of its range, but a localized elevation that the instrument registers and the investigator notes, and the subsequent report records. The reading settles back to baseline as the investigator continues past the water and into the open cemetery grounds beyond. Whatever produced the spike at the lagoon margin, geological, material, or otherwise, it is localized enough that a few feet of movement through the site changes the reading measurably. That localization is, itself, part of what the investigation documented and what the documentation has not yet fully explained. Mary Huff's infrared photograph from August 1991 remains what it has been since it was developed, a print that shows a grave marker in the center of the frame and seated on that marker, a figure in pale clothing whose body does not fully interrupt the stone surface behind her. The figure is clear enough to study. The pale clothing is distinct against the darker ground around the marker. The seated posture is specific, not a smear or a column or a diffuse glow, but a recognizable human form in a recognizable position on a recognizable piece of stone. No member of the investigation team reported seeing anyone in that location at the time the shutter closed. The film was developed by the method standard to the period. The print that emerged from the development process has been examined, reproduced, and cited across subsequent research and documentation of the Bachelor's Grove site. It has not been conclusively identified as a double exposure, a processing artifact, a deliberate fabrication, or a team member photographed in conditions that produce the semi-transparency effect. It has also not been conclusively confirmed as a genuine anomaly. The photograph sits in the evidentiary record of the investigation at exactly the position it occupied when it was first developed. Strange, specific, undetermined. There is a particular quality to evidence that resists resolution in both directions. The Bachelor's Grove farmhouse phenomenon has that quality throughout its documented history. It does not resolve cleanly as a documented delusion. The consistency of the accounts across independent witnesses argues against that. It does not resolve cleanly as a confirmed physical structure, no foundation, no demolition record, no thermally detected wall or roof has been placed at the reported location. It does not resolve cleanly as a simple atmospheric effect, the refraction and pareidolia frameworks, while real and applicable in principle, do not account for the entire body of evidence as it stands. And it does not resolve cleanly as a confirmed anomaly. The evidentiary standard for that conclusion has not been met either. The question sits in the space between these positions, held by the evidence that has been gathered, and limited by the evidence that has not yet been gathered, or perhaps cannot be. That space is where genuine open questions live, and the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse has lived there for a long time. Psychologists and investigators familiar with structural analysis of anomalous witness testimony have noted something specific about the Bachelor's Grove farmhouse accounts when they are compared to the broader body of retreating apparition literature. The retreating phenomenon, a structure or figure that maintains a fixed distance from an observer, regardless of the observer's approach, appears in accounts from across several countries and several centuries, in contexts where the witnesses could not have been exposed to a common source. A retreating house in an American forest preserve in the 1960s. A retreating chapel on a coastal headland in Ireland. A retreating stone tower on a hillside in Scotland in the 18th century. The structural feature is consistent. The advance, the maintained distance, the inability to close the gap, and the structural consistency across geographically and culturally separated accounts has led researchers to propose two distinct explanatory possibilities. One is that the structural consistency reflects a real perceptual phenomenon, something in the environment or in the observer's perceptual apparatus under specific conditions that reliably produces the experience of an object maintaining distance during approach. The other is that the structural consistency reflects cultural transmission, a widely distributed story template that, once absorbed, shapes how anomalous visual experiences are interpreted and reported. Distinguishing between these two possibilities for any given account requires knowing what the witness knew before the experience. For the pre-legend Bachelor's Grove witnesses, that question is harder to answer than it might initially appear. The condition of the Bachelor's Grove cemetery grounds today holds its own kind of documentary record. The vandalism of the 1970s and 1980s has never been fully remediated. Grave markers that were overturned or broken in that period remain damaged or absent. The stones that were stolen from the site and later recovered have been returned where possible, but many have not been located. The grounds themselves, the second-growth woodland of the Rubio Woods Forest Preserve, pressing in from every side, the oak and hickory canopy overhead, the leaf litter on the paths, the lagoon sitting at its low margin beside the older section of the cemetery, continue in the condition that time and human action have left them. The Forest Preserve District of Cook County maintains access to the site along the quarter-mile unpaved path off the Midlothian Turnpike. The path is still there. The cemetery is still there. The lagoon is still there, its surface reflecting whatever sky sits above it on any given morning, its depth unchanged by the decades of investigation and documentation and unresolved question that have accumulated around it. A thermal camera trained on the field margin at the Bachelor's Grove Cemetery entrance, late on an autumn afternoon, catches the moment the light shifts from afternoon to dusk with considerable precision. The temperature gradient between the lagoon's surface and the wooded air above it is at its clearest in this hour, the water still holding the warmth of the day, the air above the canopy already losing it. The transition zone where the two temperatures meet, producing the fine moisture layer that will thicken into ground fog as the evening progresses. The camera shows this gradient in clean graded color. It shows the tree line as a band of relative warmth where the living wood holds heat, and the open field margin as a cooler zone between the path and the trees, and the path itself as a thread of slightly disturbed ground temperature, where footfalls have compressed the leaf litter over years of use. The camera shows all of this with accuracy and in real time, and at the location along the wooded margin where the farmhouse has been reported, at the distance from the path where witnesses have placed the porch railings and the lit window, and the dirt track leading to the front steps, the camera shows the ambient temperature of an empty field, nothing differentiated from its surroundings, nothing standing where the accounts have placed a house for half a century. The Ghost Research Society's published report from the 1991 investigation has been cited in subsequent research, documentaries, published books on the Bachelor's Grove phenomena, and online databases of paranormal field investigations. It is a real document. The organization has maintained its records across the decades since the investigation was conducted, and the report's findings, the elevated EMF readings, the photographic anomalies, the witness accounts gathered on site and from the broader record, the mapped locations of the elevated readings within the cemetery grounds remain available to researchers who want to examine the primary material. Kosmarek's methodology at the time of the investigation followed the practices standard to the field, and the documentation produced by the team that August Knight has held up as a carefully recorded account of what the investigation found and what it did not find. The file is not closed. No subsequent investigation has produced evidence that supersedes or refutes the 1991 findings in a way that changes the fundamental open question. The readings were what they were. The photograph is what it is. The farmhouse accounts continued to accumulate after the investigation concluded. There is something specific about an open case that has been open for a long time. Not just the question at its center, the specific unresolved phenomenon, the gap between what was observed and what current understanding accounts for, but the physical record of the inquiry itself. The plat maps on the archive table, the EMF readings in the filed report, the infrared photograph in the organization's records, the two witness accounts from the 1960s and the 1980s, separated by 20 years and carrying the same description. These documents exist. They are held in specific places. They can be retrieved and examined and read, and they accumulate over time into something that is neither an answer nor a dead end, a body of material that represents the sustained attention of many different investigators across many different years applied to the same location and the same question, without arriving at a conclusion that satisfies the full range of the evidence. The lagoon at Bachelor's Grove holds its own particular stillness in the hours before dawn. The water surface, which produces its characteristic ground fog during the evening temperature transitions, settles by the time the temperature differential narrows toward morning, and the fog thins and retreats, and the surface of the water becomes visible again, gray and still, reflecting the last of the dark above it, the shoreline low and soft, where the bank drops away quickly into the depth. The trees around the lagoon are old enough to have been present in some form during the decades when the cemetery was in active use, and the surrounding farmland was cultivated, and the founding families were still maintaining the grounds. The hickories and oaks at the water margin have the diameter of trees that have stood through the better part of a century, their bark deeply furrowed, their roots running well below the water line into the saturated low-lying ground. They have been here for the whole of the documented period of the phenomenon. They were here when the plat maps were drawn. They were here when the first sightings were reported. They are here now, and they will be here when the archive table is cleared, and the plat maps are refolded, and the report is returned to its file. The question of what witnesses have been seeing at Bachelor's Grove, the white farmhouse with the porch and the lit window, receding before each approach across however many evenings it has appeared and retreated in the wooded margin by the cemetery entrance, is a question that the evidentiary record has not resolved, and that honest assessment of the record does not permit resolving in either direction with the material available. The atmosphere and the terrain at the site create real and documented optical conditions that could produce visual anomalies of specific kinds. The body of eyewitness accounts contains features, cross-temporal consistency, cross-witness specificity, pre-legend reportage that the purely environmental explanations address only partially. The historical record of agricultural settlement in the area provides a plausible basis for a physical structure having once stood near the reported location, and the physical survey of the site has not produced a foundation or a remnant or a thermal signature that confirms a structure was ever there. All of this is true simultaneously. The case holds all of it. Cook County plat map records are filed in sequence by township and range, and the folded paper of the Bachelor's Grove area surveys has been opened and refolded enough times over the decades of this inquiry that the fold lines have become slightly worn at the intersections, the paper thin but intact, the ink still legible, the property boundaries still clear. A researcher who unfolds the map on a quiet afternoon in the records office and traces the boundary of the agricultural parcel closest to the cemetery entrance is doing something that has been done before by other researchers in the same room or in rooms with similar light and similar rows of shelved documents and similar quality of silence. They are looking for the same thing. The search has been conducted with care. The records have been examined thoroughly. The footprint of a building in the precise location where the farmhouse has been reported has not been found there, and the absence of that footprint is part of the record too, not as a definitive refutation, but as an honest accounting of what the historical documentation does and does not contain. The Ghost Research Society's 1991 investigation report sits in a filing system somewhere in the organization's records. It is a real document in a real place. Its pages describe what the investigators found during the August survey, the EMF elevations near the older grave markers, the anomalous readings along the lagoon path, the photograph that emerged from the developed infrared film showing a figure that no one on the team had seen, and they described those findings in the careful, specific language of investigators who documented what they observed without asserting more than their instruments and their film had actually recorded. The report has been open in the sense of unresolved since the night it began to be written. Its findings have circulated. They have been examined. They have not been superseded. The investigation is ongoing in the way that genuinely open cases remain ongoing, not because no one has looked, but because what has been found has not yet been enough to close the question, and the question continues to sit at the center of whatever has been found, patient and specific and still present. The unpaved path off the Midlothian Turnpike is a quarter-mile long. It runs through second-growth woodland, oak and hickory, and the understory plants of the Rubio Woods Forest Preserve, from the turnpike to the cemetery entrance, and the sound of traffic on the road behind a visitor fades within the first 100 yards as the trees absorb it and the compressed quiet of the woodland takes its place. The path has been walked by investigators, historians, photographers, casual visitors, and researchers whose notebooks are now in archives and whose EMF readings are now in filed reports, and whose questions are now part of the documented body of inquiry that is accumulated around this particular piece of ground in Bremen Township, Cook County, Illinois. The cemetery at the end of the path holds between 75 and 200 individuals by various historical estimates, their names carved into limestone that has been standing in the Cook County weather for 150 to 180 years. The path is still there. The cemetery is still there. The lagoon is still there, at its low margin beside the older section of the grounds, its surface moving in whatever wind finds it through the canopy.